and it is, what do you think about the new Google Autopilot?
Yeah. So Google Autopilot. So I presume the question was more like, what are your thoughts about the new GKE Autopilot? I would say, so GKE Autopilot is a new mode of operation with Google Kubernetes Engine. So Google Kubernetes Engine is a managed Kubernetes provided by Google, and they have now taken a one step forward, actually easing out users by introducing GKE Autopilot. So for that, to make a comparison, I'm probably going to compare a little bit of like apples and oranges. So it's not really good to compare a hosted Kubernetes engine versus GKE Autopilot, but I would still continue to do so because I see that a lot of adoption for the hosted Kubernetes engines in the customers and all around the world. So so I would actually take this question like, what if can I go to GKE Autopilot, or what does it mean to go to GKE Autopilot? So in a high level, as I mentioned, GKE Autopilot would abstract the control plane and also the slave node. So the idea is that, okay, let's get back to the hosted Kubernetes engine first of all. So in a what is a hosted Kubernetes or a managed Kubernetes engine? It was like when so the control plane is actually provided by the vendor. So you don't actually have to worry about the control plane. So you don't have to take care of your API server and kubelet and so on and so forth. So it's just provided by the vendor. And then there are nodes which are actually the ones which actually cost the billing, and that's where you run your workloads. So in managed Kubernetes cluster, you could actually get a full control over your access, security, logging, monitoring, scaling, etc. And this comes out of box. There is for Azure Kubernetes cluster, Google's and the Amazon's, they all come out of box. So this is not going to change in GKE Autopilot. So GKE Autopilot is actually going to retain all these things. So it's not going to change there. However, the biggest change comes in the billing. So the idea is that until this point, when you run managed Kubernetes cluster in one of your cloud vendors, you would be basically billed per node. So if you start a Kubernetes cluster, then your billing basically starts, irrespective of the fact that you run workloads on it or you don't. For the GKE Autopilot, they went one step forward, starting to claiming that, okay, the billing or the SLA is basically per pod. So basically per your workload. So how does, and the pod is actually requesting for a resource, right? Like, so it needs a certain amount of vCPU, it needs a certain amount of memory, and that's what is actually going to the billing. So the idea is this, that Google thinks that it would actually saves a tremendous amount of cost for the customers. So there was also a claim that some big customers would actually even get 50% benefit if they are moving to GKE Autopilot. However, so there is like, with control comes lots of responsibility. So in the sense, when you have less control in GKE Autopilot, you basically have less responsibility, you have less control. So in the sense, one of the feature a lot of people would actually love to use is the node affinity, which don't work in GKE Autopilot. There is definitely pod and anti-affinity, pod affinity and anti-affinity, but in GKE Autopilot, you don't have the node affinity because you don't basically control the node. Basically, you don't control how the nodes are upgraded and so on and so forth. So all the security patches and everything is like comes from the vendor itself. So that's one of the drawbacks with that. And also at the time of release, which was just released last month, they mentioned that there is only support for container optimized operating system. So which is a kind of a Google's own COS operating system for containers, and that's the only operating system supporter. So if your workload is actually running on Ubuntu or Windows, GKE Autopilot is not for you. This also means that you cannot run privileged containers. So in general, it is very much specific to your operating system and so on and so forth. So was it like 2 weeks ago when GKE Autopilot was released, I did a spin, right? Try to run one of our test workload, it worked. And then when I tried to partially deploy a production workload, it kind of failed. Then I saw that inside our production workload, we have mentioned node affinity, and that doesn't work. So from the from the Google's point of view, GKE Autopilot is something they've just launched. They would actually recommend people to start using in their DevOps. However, over time, if things work out really well, and they would recommend to move from dev to the prod. So they don't even recommend right away, though it's in a GA state, general availability, but still Google doesn't recommend. But I wanted to actually highlight something here. So in 2015, when GKE was introduced, 2014 when Kubernetes was actually open source, and 2015 when GKE was introduced, people were actually kind of worried and wondering, like, okay, the control plane is going to go into the vendor, so you don't actually have control with your API server's process, or if you want to pass an extra parameter and so on and so forth. It's not possible. So people were actually a little bit worried, and then Google made this kind of a drastic step. And however, I think that at least they managed to get most of the customers to adopt into this kind of approach. And hence, Amazon and Azure, they all followed this approach because it was really easy to use. You just go and click cluster, it's ready. You can actually start spinning your workloads and so on and so forth. So GKE Autopilot, I think it is definitely a step in the right direction for Google. There could be drawbacks with this. However, Google claims that GKE, the standard mode, is going to stay, and Autopilot is also going to stay. So it's not that they are phasing out. So in a sense, GKE Autopilot is definitely worth a try, I would say. If you do things with the limitations, if you know the limitations and if you do it kind of in a Google's way, like in a correct way.
So this Autopilot is, well, for people who don't know about it, including me, if I understand correctly, it's kind of like a simplified version of GKE, in which you can get some savings depending on which configuration you use, but at the same time you compromise some of the customization that you could have if you were running your own cluster. Yeah,
exactly. So you don't have to start paying for your nodes. You might actually run a bigger nodes, and then you could actually define scale sets on the nodes. Usually the claim is that the workload is not utilizing the full resources. Because when the server is like fully utilized, your performance is going to go down. So in the sense, you might actually have failure requests and so on and so forth. So that percentage of buffer is actually something which we are paying, and Google says that would actually be saved if you go to GKE Autopilot.
So it feels kind of like a trend towards this, the same approach that Amazon, for example, introduced with the Lambdas, in which you were not paying for the whole server, but you were just paying for what you were using. So you just like spawn the function that you're using, and then that's it. You just pay. And it sounds like it's kind of going towards the same trend.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of listened to one of the podcasts, and then there was a question like, hey, now that you're making a step towards savings, why don't you go to basically like serverless, so basically like nodeless? Why don't you go to nodeless Kubernetes? So in the sense, only for the not even for the workload, but only for the request and so on and so forth. So kind of the reply was like, it breaks the stateful sets and so on and so forth, which is one of the requirements of, as mentioned, that it's a requirement of API requirement. But still, I think there would be time when we are going in that direction too. That now, as of today, if you even in GKE Autopilot, if you run a pod and no requests are not served from the pod, then you're still going to pay. But anyway, That's probably definitely in their list. So that was a very nice question. So there is also people asking about why should you, instead of taking this intermediate step, why don't you just go to the nodeless approach?
Yeah, exactly. Why not just quit cold turkey? And there's a comment from Lauri Suomalainen on the chat about the GKE infrastructure management, that you still have to know how to operate the Kubernetes workloads. Which
I think
if you're using this autopilot, it kind of removes some of that complexity.
Yeah, I think, yes, you still have definitely control on your manifests and so on and so forth. So
yeah. There are some differences, but it sounds like in many ways similar to Amazon's EKS by Fargate, or so-called serverless Kubernetes.
Yeah, definitely. So this is why I said that actually the comparison should have been like GKE Autopilot versus Fargate and things like this, instead of talking from the hosted or managed Kubernetes cluster to GKE Autopilot. But I think it kind of gives you a better picture, like, can I go to GKE or these kind of autopilot-like projects from my existing clusters? Yeah.
In the end, it depends on what requirements do you have and how much are you willing to invest into it.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Anoop. I think it was a very good explanation, even for people who had no idea about what autopilot is, like me.
Yeah.
So,
me included. This was so new that I heard it last week.
Yeah, I think most of us just heard about it during our preparation session. So yeah, it's nice to hear.
Yes, yeah, just for you to know, this was just released 3 weeks before, so this is new.
So it might change at some point in the future.